Okay, now we have our map here. This is the Arabian Peninsula, and I just put a couple of key points. So the Valley of Lemuel, or as most modern day scholars like Hugh Nibley, like S. Can, they refer to it as Wadi Tayyib, which is most likely what it is today. And what a wadi is, it's very similar to a slot canyon here in southern Utah, or I guess down in St. George, southern Utah. And the wadis are like little oases in the desert. There's moisture there. They're one of the few inhabitable places in these harsh climates, and that's where they were camped. Now, this distance between the Valley of Lemuel and Jerusalem, not only was it a substantial distance, but it also came with some elevation gain as well, because they were down at sea level. As we read in 1 Nephi, we know that they were on the eastern shore of the Red Sea, so at about sea level, and Jerusalem's at about 2,500 feet. And it's interesting now too, because these places are still very important in the world. If you think of Yemen, if you think of things that have been happening in the Straits of Aqaba, and just the halt on shipping, it's incredibly important shipping lane. In the old world, there were important trade routes here, and the scholarly work that's done by these just amazing, esteemed individuals has a lot to do with what trade routes and what routes they would have actually used, simply because this, from the Valley of Lemuel to Jerusalem, is about 180 miles, but that's as the crow flies. And you have to think this is some of the harshest desert in the world, extremely hot pretty much all year round, and then it cools off in the night, like a typical desert climate. And so more likely what they've assessed from reading the scriptures, from doing the scholarly work, is that their journey would have been something more like 275 miles, but that's one way. So round trip, that's a minimum of 500 miles. So this was a big ask. This was huge. I've never gone on a foot journey more than 100 miles. So to times that by 5 in a harsh desert without any of the modern amenities is just incredible, and it really blew my mind. And then they calculate, so if this was 500 miles to get there one way, you know, how much traveling were they doing per day? And we know that these were acclimated, younger, strong individuals. And so because there were some fit young dudes, it was most likely around 15 to 20 miles. And when you extrapolate that out, just in the walking time alone, that would be a minimum of 28 days. But it was most likely much longer. That's not counting the time that they actually spent in Jerusalem. And so, yeah, that's pretty steep. That's pretty tough. I wanted to touch on this briefly, but one of the reasons why I decided to do this and why it was so personal to me was because my family, from the years of 2016 to 2018, we lived in Muscat. I was in middle school and high school, and I actually had the opportunity with my young men's group to go down to Salalah, where scholars believe is bountiful. Why is that? It's because Salalah is facing towards the coast, so it gets coastal wind and moisture, but there's a mountain grouping that kind of groups around the coast and creates this microcosm climate where it can actually rain. And it's one of the very few places that one could ever jump to the conclusion that this is bountiful. And I actually had a really powerful spiritual experience aiding with the BYU Archaeological Dig team. We drove to the mountain. Also, one other thing is this is right on the border with Yemen, which has been in a civil war for over the past 14 years. And so there's lots of security. It's kind of hard to get to Salalah. And the BYU Archaeological Dig team, they came down here and then they took a boat to the coast. If you don't take a boat, you have to hike over the mountains. So me, my brother, and a few others from our small, tiny branch in Muscat, Oman, we hiked through the mountains, and it was about a 14-hour hike. We started very early in the morning, but incredibly difficult. And I'll show some pictures of that too. There were just the most phenomenal flora and fauna. It was unbelievable, especially coming from So dry, so deserty, Muscat, Oman. But anyways, diving into the provisions and the actual, I guess, the logistics of this travel. And some of this, I was required to refer to the Old Testament to get other details and just overall contextualize the situation. Like what foods were available to them, what methods and technologies of water storage. I'll discuss all those things here. So nowhere in Nephi does it talk about them using beasts of burden like camels, donkeys, mules, anything like that. Those pack animals, which would have alleviated a lot of the weight that they would have to carry. So most likely they were just going on foot. Now for food, at that time in the world, they most likely would have had dried bread. This would have been like the form of flatbread made on a fire. Dried meat is another possible, but most likely a lot of dried fruit. So this would have been dates and figs, because dried dates and dried figs, they're very calorically dense and they hold very well and they're relatively light. All very important factors. At this time, there was also earthenware jars, but given the length of their travels, I'm going to assume, like these other scholars, that they most likely had water skins. And now it's important to note that between the valley of Lemuel and Jerusalem, there's really not a lot of water. So they would have, for certain amounts of time, they would have had to pack at least 1 or 2 days worth of water. Now a gallon of water is 8.3 pounds, and I'm sure they were rationing, but for a grown man hiking through that kind of heat, you would need a lot of water. So I'm sure they were thirsty most of the time, and still were likely carrying up to 15 pounds of water, 2 gallons, in between water destinations, which is so heavy and so much. So if they were consuming about a half pound, it would depend on the composition and makeup of what their food consisted of. But if they were to be consuming about a half pound or 2,000 calories, which isn't nearly keeping up with the amount of calories they're burning, but if they were rationing their food, I mathematically added that up to be about 15 pounds, 16 pounds of water, 3 pounds for clothing, probably a standard cloak. They would have had sandals and maybe a knife and some flint. That would be about 3 pounds. And when they actually got the plates, this is a conservative estimate, but it could be about from 25 to 50 pounds was their guess. I read a great BYU article talking about if Nephi was able to carry the plates, and this is most certainly doable, but once again, it'd be incredibly hard, especially without a modern fitted hiking pack. You know, they would have had sacks, burlap, maybe made out of hemp, cotton, those kinds of things that were available to them. So in closing, they went about 20 miles a day with 60-pound packs, and in a given day, it would depend on which leg they were in the journey. As you get closer to Jerusalem, there's the foothills, and so the elevation increases, and sort of the highlands of Jerusalem is what they're known as. And so most of the elevation gain would have occurred there, but conservative estimate is probably 200 feet per day or something like that. So my task is to find things to emulate the plates, create a pack according with that, and then map out a 20-mile journey that I can take, where because we're here in Utah and we're so close to the mountains, I'm sure I'll be encountering more elevation gain, but it's my plan to do a 20-mile hike, probably using the Bonneville Shoreline Trail, and then to camp overnight and use the similar loadout of provisions they would have had. But yeah, I'm very excited to do this, but I'm a little bit nervous in some ways because I know it's going to be challenging. It's a heavy pack, but also just thinking about what they would have experienced and how it's so easy to look down on or perform eisegesis and see things through the modern lens and not actually diving into the scriptures and understanding just the sheer raw physicality of it all. How many times are we asked, and this is something I've been journaling about as I've been thinking and planning this process and doing the research, how many times are we asked to do something that's so simple and easy, like a ministering assignment, showing up to activities, showing up to church on time? It's so minimal compared to what these guys were asked to do. And I know that when I went on trek in Wyoming, Martin's Cove, I had a similar really powerful spiritual experience where it was just open to me. So many sections of the Doctrine and Covenants where I was thinking, wow, I'm here in the summertime and it's freezing in the morning and I don't want to get up and these carts are heavy and all these different things. And it just gave me such a profound and deep appreciation for the suffering that they went through. And I imagine to some degree I'll experience something similar, but already I'm just amazed at the faith, courage, and strength and discipleship that Nephi shows. And to some extent also his brothers, because they made these journeys with him, even if they had poor attitudes and even if they got a different lesson out of it. Nephi came closer to Christ, came closer to God, increased his faith despite all of this uncertainty, whereas his brothers, they had a very different mental state, and it really colored their experience in a different way. And that's also been another unique insight to come out of this project. But wish me luck. Late, and the journey's been completed. This would have represented one single leg of the return journey, Nephi and his brothers carrying the plates, hence the loaded pack. Now, per my preparations and research, I was allotted most likely what stands in the historical record that I can be sure of that they had was dried fruits. I tried to stay true of what might have been available in that region, hence the dates. I ate and grew to love dates while living in Oman, and some mango to switch it up, so dinner. Probably definitely should have brought more water. 2 of these in a plastic water bottle was most likely not sufficient, but in order to stay true to the rations that they likely had and the availability of water sources, this is most likely it. Now, I definitely would have preferred to be in the Uintas, high mountains, or somewhere else, but because of the nature of work and school, this had to be a bit more of a local adventure, hence the Strava run on the Bonneville Trail. Stayed local, but yeah, just gonna set up camp here. My car's not too far away, civilization isn't too far away, unlike what I'm representing here, but I feel like it gets the job done. This isn't the animal skin that they would have had, but it's what I have available to me, and I'm not so worried about it. Just like they probably weren't worried about being too cold either, although it can get very cool in the desert climates, especially on the Arabian Peninsula. The temperature does tend to drop. Utah is also a desert, so it's subject to similar climatic change during the night, but it's actually not too bad right now. It's on the warmer side, but I imagine I'll be fine and toasty throughout the night. And finally, a look at the bare bones essentials of what was brought with me. Toilet paper, because they had access to something as well. And my plates are still secure. Thank you for accompanying me on my journey. I hope you learned something. I certainly have learned a lot. It was a really cool experience to dive into the scriptures and experience the raw physicality of it all, and the adventure and the trials and struggles, just a taste of what our ancient and beloved prophets experienced. It's been very cool. Thank you.